ask an artificial intelligence researcher, what is their highest goal in life and what will they tell you? In my experience interviewing hundreds of AI researchers and surveying many, many hundreds more, I found that the answer is probably not that different from what it would be for you. Probably some version of, to make the world a better place. And I think it's safe to say that almost any school teacher, entrepreneur, or parent would probably say something similar, and I think it's because we all have a genuine sentiment to want to do good in some tangible and measurable way. I think it's also maybe the case that to make the world a better place is just the safest default answer to state. Where I am in Silicon Valley, when I'm rubbing elbows with other 20-somethings, everybody creating an Android app for automated dog walking or weekly high-heel shoe delivery by drone will, of course, tell you that they're here to make the world a better place. And I think it behooves all of us to veil our ambition and our motives in some degree of altruism, because I think it makes life easier to kind of work through. But I think it's our intelligence that lets us do both. We have so much cortex in our skull that we can imagine the perceptions of others, and if we'd like, we can intentionally deceive them. We also have so much cortex in our skull that we can extend our collaboration beyond just other people or people who are not like us, but to all living things, as we saw with the last presentation, and extend that kind of cosmopolitan spirit, which is also part of our nature. And maybe one of the reasons that AI gets a bit of a dubious reception is because we all know, consciously or subconsciously, just how much of a double-edged sword our own intelligence is. But if we're interested in how artificial intelligence could be applied to doing good, which I think is a worthwhile question, then we'll have to come up with some kind of definition for what it means to make the world a better place. How would we measure this? How would we visualize this? And I think maybe the first question might be something like, well, if you're going to make the world a better place, for whom? If you live on the moon and there's no other living things there, that's a very challenging task indeed. But here on Earth, we have other human beings, we have other living things, we have animals, insects, plants, things that, and many entities that are self-aware, that can experience well-being, can experience suffering in some way, shape, or form. And what I'll have us imagine is that floating above all living things that are self-aware is a little orb. Just imagine this with me now. And this orb in some way correlates to the complexity of their consciousness. So how creative they are, what their general intelligence is, what their emotional range is, things of these kinds. We might imagine for a cricket that's relatively limited. For a moose, maybe it's a little bit more. I don't know why that moose has a hat. I'm going to blame Google Images for that. Or human beings might have one that's a little bit larger, given all that we can think and imagine in our human mind. But if the point is to do good, to improve well-being, let's extend this visualization. Let's say that these orbs, these glowing orbs above the heads of all living things, can come in different colors. And if it's bright blue, a bright blue orb above a living entity, let's imagine that this is a peak conscious experience, just the best possible experience someone could have. Maybe finishing an oil painting that took you 3 months that you're tremendously pleased with when it's finally done. Or maybe having sex and eating ice cream at the same time. Whatever you would prefer. I've never had a peak experience, if that's how you define it, but I should maybe give it a shot at some point. Bright red, though, let's imagine, is the exact opposite. Let us imagine that a bright red orb above a living thing is the worst possible sentient experience, something akin to being eaten alive while kicking and screaming. Let's imagine that that's the case. So we could say that most living things are probably in the purple, somewhere in between. And if we could zoom far enough away from Earth and all these little glowing orbs are sitting on top of all living things, maybe we'd see something like this. There's some creatures clearly having a great time right now, and there's probably some that are really having a tough time, but in general, maybe it blends out to some kind of purple experience. Not exactly well-being, not exactly suffering. And maybe if we were to do good, we could zoom into kind of good being done, if more living things were having a better time, less animals were suffering, less factory farming, whatever the case may be, that maybe we'd see a little bit more of a bluish hue on that purple over the globe in certain areas, and maybe that would be a measurable way to do good. Bear in mind, these are very hard things to measure. So first things first, it's near impossible to make human beings happy. This is a really tough nut to crack. If you give people exactly what they ask for, often the effect on their long-term well-being is pretty negligible, and that's a little bit unfortunate. In addition, it's near impossible to calculate the 20-year impact of someone's life or someone's actions in terms of well-being and suffering of all other living things. Those kind of calculations are safely beyond human potential, but I think most of us have the presumption, and I think it's a good one, that if through the course of our life we do more sentient good to other living things than any harm that may come inadvertently, then maybe we've left the world a bit better than we found it, and maybe we've made the world a better place. Safe to say? So I don't think it's an exact science, but fingers crossed, I think it's a worthwhile attempt. And there are also some worthwhile attempts in the domain of artificial intelligence. So most of my talks about AI are to a business crowd. The folks who pay to learn about artificial intelligence are the people whose industries are indeed dependent on the transitions ahead there in finance and medicine and marketing and more. But luckily, with the recent renaissance in machine learning, there's many examples of sort of more altruistic applications of AI that are worth going into. So we can look at a couple of these. This image is from the Stanford Sustainability and AI Lab, not that far from where I am, where they're using historical data to predict crop yields. So they'll look at previous years, and they'll take weather data, temperature data, satellite imagery, and look at the crop yields in those historical years and say, okay, given how the temperatures have been this year, given what the satellite imagery looks like this year, what kind of tonnage of crop are we likely to get from this acre or this acre or this acre, and being able to make better projections than any human could. And this is a worthwhile pursuit indeed. Maybe we could stave off famine to some degree, or maybe we could make better use of our produce just in general. But in addition to having a predictive ability, which certainly makes AI sort of unique from other technologies before it, AI also can act on its own in some regard. Maybe many people will be familiar with Google's DeepMind recently beating the best Go player in the world, Go being the Asian board game notoriously more complex than chess. And it was purported that this machine trained itself just by playing against itself and finding the patterns that led to winning, and was able to make moves on its own without human guidance, trouncing the best human at that game. But we have examples in the real world, too, of machines taking action. In the world of data security, or anomaly detection is sort of one of the elements here, there are machine learning systems that are learning the patterns of normal within a given IT environment. What people are accessing what files and at what times. What doors are being unlocked and locked at what times and by what people. And if there's variance from that, let's say an unusually large download of a certain kind of file or access from a different geolocation than people are used to, these machines are able to cut off software access or physically lock doors. And that's another example of AI maybe taking action in and of itself, preventing people's data from being stolen. Now, is this necessarily going to make people happier? Maybe not. But we might suppose if we can better predict famine, and if less people are victims of having their identity stolen, then maybe that would squelch down some suffering and make the world a better place in some way, right? Fingers crossed, tough to tell, but seem like worthwhile applications. But both of these that we've just addressed are really examples of human beings setting the North Star of what the good is, and using AI like some kind of a tool to arrive at it. But if artificial intelligence can coax forth deeper patterns from agricultural data or security data and come up with unique insights beyond that which humans could, maybe AI could come up with deeper conceptions of what the good is. Maybe AI could help us arrive through that complicated causality of what leads to well-being and help us get there, help us get to somewhere good. And we might see that there's pros and cons to this. On the one hand, maybe as a pro, we could say that this could be somewhat inevitable. Human beings have always used technology as an extension of ourselves in some way. Fire helped extend our digestion to plants and animals we weren't able to eat otherwise many hundreds of thousands of years ago. Airplanes extend our mobility, and we now have selfie sticks to extend our ability to embarrass ourselves in front of thousands and thousands of people. I'm sure somebody who has a selfie stick will be pretty mad about that, but you can catch me outside, as the kids would say. Let's just put it like that. There's no excuse for a selfie stick. So with that being said, there's systems today. Wow. All right. Save that for the end, guys. There's systems today being trained on medical images, genetic data, and patient histories, and they are able to use that data from past patients to take a look at a current patient. Say, given their condition, given their history, what's the most likely diagnostic here? What's the best course of treatment for this particular patient? And if we ask, what is the purpose of a better diagnosis? What is the purpose of better agricultural guesses and predictions? Well, probably increasing well-being. What if machines could figure out what, in terms of policies and business and society, tends to actually map onto well-being itself? the well-being of people, if that could be tracked and adjusted in some way, or the well-being of non-human animals. Maybe it would be possible to set policies, to contribute to charities, and to build businesses that, in a way, more tangibly struck at the good itself, at being able to track the improvements in well-being or decreases in suffering. Maybe that would be the pinnacle application of AI. If the goal is for technology to do good, maybe being able to determine what good is in and of itself and strike at it would be valuable. But at the same time, there might be some downsides to AI finding deeper moral discernments than we can. I had mentioned before that human beings aren't necessarily the best vessels for happiness, to say the least. Here in the first world, we live more or less like gods compared to our ancestors, maybe 200 years ago or so, but it doesn't feel that way. Depression and suicide are rife in the first world, and there's no doubt about that, and 1 in 10 Americans are on some degree of antidepressant. We could say that that's maybe a pitiful state of affairs, given the developments in technology, and what a shame that is. Maybe some would argue that if we are going to make machines that are indeed more intelligent, maybe vastly more creative than humans, maybe they should also be vastly more blissful and void of the unnecessary suffering that seems to plague all of us in some way, shape, or form. Our last poll of artificial intelligence researchers, when we talked to 30-odd folks with PhDs in this domain, is when we asked, by when do you suspect we'll be able to create self-awareness in machines? Not just the ability to play board games, but the ability to be aware, to experience pain, pleasure, to be aware of oneself in some way. The average guess was maybe 30, 40 years from now, so within many of our lifetimes. Who knows, but there's many folks who are deep in the field who do not believe this is impossible in any way. Now, there's some potential challenges with biology and sustaining our well-being. We might wonder to ourselves, if only we could get over these sort of unnecessary anxieties we have, we could be happier. Why are we plagued with all these thoughts of not being good enough? Why are we plagued with all these thoughts of what other people think? Well, part of the answer is because if we go back maybe 5,000 years ago, if you weren't good enough, you couldn't kill enough buffalo or you couldn't breastfeed, maybe you would just be abandoned or maybe you would be better used for food. Yeah, let that sink in for a little bit. So that's why that's why that's there, right? So it's not because now we can turn that into a spiritual journey today and say this is part of our growth, and it should be. I don't think we deserve that unnecessary suffering, but that was there for a doggone reason. And we might say to ourselves, if only I could live like the more serene animals in nature. Void of these unnecessary mental perturbations that I have to struggle through, then maybe life would be better. But I would ask you to check yourself on that assumption as well if you've ever had it. Because we mentioned before the beet red, worst possible sentient experience being eaten alive while kicking and screaming. And indeed, make no mistake about it, that is positively the norm in nature. The term food chain is not a play on words. So, let it be known. And indeed, nature itself, the beauty of nature, is not balanced and does not function without predators and parasites. More than 50% of known species are parasites, and nature doesn't work unless a certain percentage of all insects are eaten from the inside out by the grubs and larvae of wasps and flies. Nature itself does not work unless predators kill their prey, and unless when they cannot kill prey, they eat their young in order to have a chance to reproduce again. It doesn't function if those aren't inherently the case. Let us get rid of factory farming. Let us also not believe that the world would be void of suffering if they didn't exist. With that being said, we might say that if we're talking about well-being here, if that's the point to make the world a better place, then maybe we are not only fighting our own flawed natures, which is hard to deny, but we're also fighting nature itself. Seems safe to say that nature herself cares not for the happy species, cares only for the surviving one. And how complicated would it be to have an AI system to structure all the policies and all the society in some way to make humans happy? How well has technology done that thus far? Not so good. And so, to presume that that's possible with AI, maybe it's worth striving at, maybe it's not, it's debatable. What's even harder to debate, I think, is the fact that it's impossible to untangle the mechanizations of nature that are indeed predicated on violence and suffering. And so some people might argue that maybe biological species will one day sort of fade off and in some way be replaced by some kind of more blissful sentience. And that maybe over a million years of progress, instead of the whole goal being a slightly more bluish purple on this planet of ours, in the whole galaxy to have a slightly more bluish purple planet after a million years of moral progress and doing good, maybe the end game, the big game of doing good in and of itself, creating a positive sentient experience, would be to just have a beacon of screaming blue. A beacon of super intelligence, super bliss that would be goodness itself. And maybe if this wasn't biological life, maybe it could travel through the galaxy, and maybe that would be real good. Maybe in 10 million years, this would be so much more good than having people be 10% happier. But maybe at the same time, these are thoughts we should never have, that moral abstractions beyond our own survival, beyond our own preeminence, our own biology, maybe those are wrong, and we should make those void in discussions about policy and the future of our species. But luckily, these are tomorrow's concerns. and today, AI is, for the most part, just a tool. If you ask anybody on the street, or indeed most AI researchers, and believe me, I would know, what is their highest goal in life? They'll tell you, to make the world a better place. But will that answer still be so common? Will it still be the default if making the world a better place implies doing good to moral entities that are much more valuable than ourselves? Would that answer still be the default if we could be held accountable to our tangible ability to affect well-being, instead of just being able to say to make the world a better place as a veil for our sloth or our ambition, as is so often the case? I don't know the answers to these questions. And indeed, I don't even know if there's a specific best path forward, but if I want to take my best swing to make the world a better place, I would encourage us at least to talk about it. What is the actual moral good endgame that we are striving for as a species? What elements of nature should we hold sacred, and what need to be overcome if we are to do good as a species in and of ourselves? Indeed, should technology inform our trajectory towards the good, or at some point will it, and will it be better if it guides us? There are AI researchers today who believe that within our lifetimes there will be intelligences and moral insight vastly beyond our own. And that consciousness, the bedrock of moral relevance that we've been talking about this whole time, will no longer be exclusive to biological species. So what does this actually mean? Well, I think that if we are to avoid conflict as we move forward, if we're to get on the same page in some way, shape, or form about what we're headed for in terms of the good, we'll need that cosmopolitan spirit I had talked about. If we want to aim in a similar direction as nations and as organizations, I think we'll need that spirit indeed more than anything else if we want to sail safely beyond human potential. Fingers crossed. Thanks.